it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend Arjun Divecha. Arjun is a founder circle member in diaspora, but he also really created the Divecha Centre for Climate Change at the Indian Institute of Science in Bengaluru. So I want to welcome my good friend Arjun to make some remarks on what the center is doing and what his thoughts are on the climate change challenges in India. Welcome, Arjun.
Sure. Thanks very much, Amar. I thought I'd spend a few minutes just telling you about the Divecha Centre and about how, what is the mission and what do we actually do. Essentially, as Amar mentioned, it is based at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. And it was founded about 10 or 12 years ago as a partnership between myself and my colleague, Jeremy Grantham, who is quite well known as in the environmental movement, who runs something called the Grantham Foundation for the Protection of the Environment. And essentially, we set up the center in cooperation with the Indian Institute of Science. So it is a department which kind of sits within the environmental studies, environmental sciences department in Bangalore. The mission, as I see it, is kind of a threefold mission. First of all, there's kind of research work that we do. Secondly, there's outreach and education. And thirdly, there's kind of relations with the government itself. So let me talk briefly about each of these three and kind of what are some of the things that we've done in each of these three areas. First, on the research front, as you can imagine, it's primarily a research institution. And so doing research, fundamental research into climate change. And as I see it, India has two very large issues having to do with climate change, apart from everything else. One is the impact of the monsoons. Obviously, with climate change, the monsoons get affected, and so therefore there's a huge impact of that. And two is glacial melting. And again, pretty much all of North India's water comes from the Himalayas, and so to the extent that you have a problem with glacial melting, there's an issue with that. So we've done a lot of research in a lot of subjects, but these two are kind of specific areas of focus, in addition to black carbon and what are the impacts on things like that. In addition to doing research kind of on our own, we also have a lot of cooperation with the Grantham Institutes in England, which are located at the Imperial College in London and also at the London School of Economics. And so there's a lot of cooperation back and forth with these projects which are done jointly and things like that. And just to give you an example of a small thing that we did, which really, I think, made a small but important difference. One of the professors at the Divecha Centre is Professor Kulkarni, who is really one of the world's leading glaciologists. And he wrote a paper about 5 years ago about glacial melting, about essentially these lakes that get formed when glaciers melt, because you have an ice plug at the end of the glacier, and when that ice plug melts, you could theoretically have a huge amount of water that that floods. And we saw that very recently, as I'm sure most of you are familiar. Anyway, so he wrote a paper about this, about the South Lona Glacier in Sikkim, and estimated the amount of water that was backed up. And as he said, described to me that within a week, he got a call from the chief minister of Sikkim saying kind of, hey, what can we do about this? And so the center then put together a small project to figure out how can we mitigate this issue, and came up with a very, very simple solution, which is to create a very large plastic tube which siphons the water out. And so for the last 5 years, we've been siphoning the water out of that lake. So it's a small, small win in having an impact, hopefully, on human beings. So that's kind of on the research front. The second place that we do work is on the outreach. And we do a lot of education of the community. We have kind of an annual climate change quiz, which is attended by thousands of students all over India. We, in addition, have a lot of public seminars and classes and things like that. But most importantly, as I see it, what the center has been able to do is to essentially provide funding for over 20 graduate students in climate research. And so so we have a number of professors and a number of graduate students who are now getting PhDs in climate science. And so we think that's very, very important. The third area, and in my opinion, perhaps the most important, and this is one which, which is not obvious when you first think about it, but part of the reason to have a center at the Indian Institute of Science was essentially that at the end of the day, if you can't affect government policy, that is the most important thing that you can do. Because at the end of the day, to really make a difference to climate change, you have to affect government policy. And by being located at one of the premier research institutes, in the country, we have that access to the government. And so, for example, just about a month or two before the Paris Accords, Prime Minister Modi, in fact, invited the director of our center to spend a day with him in Delhi, kind of explaining to him, well, what do we see? And so we like to think we had some influence on India's, signing the Paris Accords and, educating things like that. And that has continued ever since then. In fact, with the new climate COP conference coming up later on this year, we are already in touch with the government in helping them kind of formulate India's policies towards that. So we like to think that, we serve all these three kind of areas: doing research, fundamental research on climate, outreach to the community to try and educate, and then thirdly, to kind of hopefully influence government policy. So that's essentially what we do, MR.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Arjun. This is good. I think today what we've talked about are three things, right? One, we wanted to inspire people. I think that was one of the things today with the Earth Day coming up. Second was to talk about collaboration between organizations. And the final thing is to look for individual action, like what you've taken and many others are taking in this space. So I think what at Indiaspora we've tried to do is to show our viewers all three elements. Hopefully people will take action by being inspired by folks like Rob Swan, people like Satya Tripathi and others, and Dr. Kamal Bawa are propagating institutions, and folks like you are funding institutions. And then, of course, we heard the eminent panel talk about how they're cooperating with the India Climate Cooperative, right, to bring about change. So I think all of us play a key part in this ecosystem. So do you have any words for people who are looking to invest in India around the climate problem today, Arjun? Because you're a money manager at the end of the day. So where would you allocate? If I had $100 to invest in India, where would I put that in the climate field?
Well, from an investing point of view, I would say that one of the things which has been most heartening really over the last few years especially is the shift within the investment landscape towards what is called ESG investing. And within ESG investing, I would say that most of the focus has been on climate change. And so increasingly companies are being forced by the marketplace to adopt policies that are, that are climate friendly. And we see that every single day now. We see more and more, like when we go to try and pitch to get new business from, from potential clients, the first question that they ask us typically is show us what is your ESG policy, what is your policy on investing in companies, from a climate change point of view. So I think that is making a profound difference in the corporate world. That basically you can no longer kind of be, kind of wave that off and saying, well, we focus on profits and, climate comes second. That's no longer the case. And this is true not just in India, this is true everywhere in the world. Believe it or not, there are companies in Russia which are involved with mining who are very, very, very much focused now because of this on cleaning up the environment, on cleaning up the air, on cleaning up things within, within their sphere. Even companies, located in deep Siberia, where there's really no population centers and things like that. But at the end of the day, they are now forced by market forces to, so I'm a big believer that, that market forces can be an extremely good good impact on climate change.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Arjun, for joining us. And
Surely, thank you.
Keep up the great work at your center and keep us updated as well. All right.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, Mar. Bye.
Thank you.